And here we are. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to our second Saturday seminar series for December. Now, this marks 3 years of our monthly webinar series, which is pretty exciting. We've come a long way since then. And all of those are recorded and available on our website if you're ever looking for something to watch when there's nothing on TV. There they are. I'm Susan Jones, and I'm here at the Animas Museum. And joining us today are Julie Bell and Jan Gunya, authors of the newly released book, Women of the Colorado Gold Rush Era. Now, I first met Jan when she was doing research for this book. Back during COVID, I think it was. She was looking for the special New Year's edition of the 1888 Durango Herald that had an article on the Baker Party for their chapter on Mary Melissa Nye Hall. And as it turned out, nobody had that particular edition, but we did in our collections. If you're looking for it, the catalog number is 9221661. And we were excited to be able to get her the article that she was looking for. But as an aside, it was kind of challenging because the papers in those days were printed on paper that was 22 inches tall and 30 1/2 inches wide. We don't have a scanner that big. And it had been encapsulated, which meant taking a picture was difficult because of the glare. So we were able to get her picture, and I'm going to take a teaching moment right here for a second. Enclosing a paper and plastic like that is actually not recommended right now in terms of curatorial practices. When you do enclose the paper or encapsulate the paper, it can create a microenvironment that can be damaging actually to the paper. And in those days, and even today, newspapers were printed on the cheapest, most acidic paper available. So they have what we call inherent vice, which means that no matter what you do to it, they're going to disintegrate. So now the best thing to do is to digitize them and store them away, which is what we did with this one. This particular paper was in extremely good condition for its age, and our colleagues in Silverton at the San Juan County Historical Society Museum do have a 42-inch scanner. And so we took the paper up there and got it scanned, and so now we do have it digital, but it's still a really big file. But let's get back to the topic at hand. And let's explore the lives of 10 unforgettable women who called Colorado home during the turbulent years of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. In this book, we're going to learn about the unsung heroism of Native American, Hispanic, Anglo, and African American women whose perseverance, hard work, and wisdom helped lay the foundation for the state of Colorado. Now, author Julie Bell has a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Colorado State University and a Master's of Science degree from Colorado School of Mines. She worked as a mechanical engineer for her entire career, including being an adjunct professor at Colorado School of Mines. But in her free time, she loved writing and researching Colorado and history. In 2015, she left engineering and sold her first Colorado history mystery. It was called The Lucky Hat Mine to the Hansen Publishing Group. In 2018, Filter Press bought her first nonfiction book, a children's biography about Elizabeth Byers. Her second Colorado history mystery was published in 2019 and her third in 2021. And you can find out more about her at her website, and I'll link to the websites in the show notes. It's jvlbell.com. Now, Jan Gunya has a Bachelor of Science in Journalism from the University of Colorado at Boulder and is a member of the Kappa Tau Alpha, the Honorary Society for Journalism and Mass Communication. Her passion for 19th century Colorado women's history began in elementary school and continues to this day. Her extensive research of Colorado pioneers has taken her beyond Colorado to Maine and Kansas, where she visited Augusta Tabor's former home and the Tabor land, respectively. While in those states, as well as Colorado, she has conducted research at state archives, museums, local historical societies, and libraries. Now, before we jump in with Julie and Jan, just some quick Zoom housekeeping for those of you on Zoom. We're using the Zoom webinar series feature, which means you're all muted and your videos are off. At the bottom of your screen, and you may need to mouse down to see it, there are some icons. To minimize distractions today, we've disabled the chat function. But if you have an immediate need or issue, please click on the Q&A icon, and I will be monitoring that as we go through today. But hold your questions to the end. Wait till the end of the talk, and we'll open up from questions. So you can either type them into the Q&A and we'll answer them at the end, or at the end, you can click on the little hand and we'll allow you to unmute and ask your question. Now, if you're in the classroom today, please hold your questions. And once we do the online questions, we'll come downstairs and answer any questions in person. And then we'll post any questions and answers in the show notes again, so you don't miss anything. This session is being recorded, and you will receive an email in 24 hours with a link to the recording and the links. And with that, here's Julie and Jan.
Thank you so much. And we thank everybody for being here and for the museum to sponsor us. And mostly though, we wanted to thank the museum and all the different places that we actually went for research. If museums were not willing to help us, we could never have written this book. And during COVID, we were sort of really lucky that we had museums open their doors to us just so we could come into research. We had librarians send us things because of course libraries are closed. So that we really appreciate all the museums and libraries, and we're honored to be here. So let me dive into Women of the Colorado Gold Rush era. As the introduction was, we have the biography of, the book is the biographies of 10 women who lived in Colorado during the gold rush years. And what we tried to do was we have women who were living here before the gold rush ever began, and we have women who came with the gold rush. And for all of them, their lives sort of show how the gold rush affected their lives and the people around them. And that was sort of our goal, is to sort of show the gold rush and the years after the gold rush and the early years of Colorado through the lives and the biographies of these women. So people always ask, why did we write Women of the Colorado Gold Rush era? So for me, it started because I was a fiction writer and my books are all historical mysteries set in the gold rush. And even though they were fiction, I did a lot of research because I wanted the history to be accurate. And one day I've got a female protagonist, and one day I was digging into the notes of, what was it really like for a woman to live here? And I found the experiences of one pioneer woman, and that was by Elizabeth Byers. And as I read through her hand-typed manuscript, I was both enthralled because it's truly an amazing document to see what it was like. She came in 1859 and lived in Denver for the next 60 years. So really a fascinating document. But I also got really pissed. Here was a woman who spent 60 years in the early years of Denver. She started some of our first charities. Her husband started the Rocky Mountain News, and he even wrote a book of biographies about people who lived in Colorado at the time. Of course, only men, no women. And there was nothing written about Elizabeth Byers. So I sort of put aside my fiction and I wrote a children's biography about her. But as we're working on it, I kept wondering, how many other women had their lives and their accomplishments forgotten or attributed to their husbands? Jan's path was similar in some ways. She was a huge fan of Colorado history, and she really spent a lot of time researching Augusta Tabor. And then she went to the Colorado Historical Society and saw here 20 years in mining camps. She lived a really remarkable life. She was oftentimes the first woman ever in a mining camp. And yet who is highlighted in this mural is, the trophy wife, Baby Doe. And I'm not saying Baby Doe didn't live an amazing life, but we wanted to write a book about women who were like us, who just lived their lives. And we wanted to see the history through their lives. So Jan will now talk about how we chose these women.
Hi. We began our process of choosing the women that we would write about by using the Society of Colorado Pioneers definition of a pioneer. And that was someone who came to the region prior to January 1st of 1861. As Julie has already mentioned, we tried to choose as diverse a group of women as possible so that they would really represent all of the women of Colorado at that time. And we tried to choose ones that settled in different parts of Colorado in order to reflect the geography involved. Our women settled from Meeker in the northwest to Los Animas in the southwest and southeast, and points in between. And we also wanted to show Colorado's history through the eyes of the women who experienced important events or at least had some contact with them. Among those events, we've managed to include the incident, the Sand Creek Massacre, the Colorado Campaign for Women's Suffrage, and the story of the Baker Expedition. We were constantly thwarted by the dearth of information about many women that sounded interesting, but there just wasn't enough there. Many of the women were illiterate and left no records of their lives, and the men of the time did not choose to write about the women. Okay. As you can see, we drew our materials from a wide variety of repositories, consulted a lot of authorities for their expertise, and scoured a wide variety and countless amount of documents in order to try to fill in the lives of the women. As Julie mentioned, most of our research was done at the height of the COVID pandemic, when we could not gain easy access to museums, libraries, and historical societies. So we had to rely on online sources and the generosity of librarians, curators, volunteers at historical societies, etc., in order to fill in the information we needed. And as your own Susan Jones has mentioned, she was one of those people to whom we are so grateful for all of the time and going way beyond the expected in order to get those materials in our hands. She has described what she did in order to let me see that Durango Herald newspaper article, but she didn't mention that she went on without me asking and gathered other materials about the Baker Party and sent those to me as well. So thank you, Susan. Okay. We sometimes came across more than one story, one version of a particular event about something in the woman's life. And we had to try to find a way to separate fact from fiction and from myth. William Kent Kruger, in his epilogue to The River We Remember, expressed so well the problems we had and the reasons for them. He wrote, quote, "Because we are only one part of the whole, the river each of us remembers is different, and there are many versions of the stories we tell about the past. In all of them, there is truth, and in all of them, a good deal of innocent misremembering." Okay.
All right, so I'm going to dive right in and talk about one of the women I wrote about. I really wanted to write about the Hispanic population in Southern Colorado, and I found that very difficult one because I don't speak Spanish, but I was very fortunate to find a relation of Maria Dolores Vallejos, and she helped me find a fair amount of information about her, and so she is who we focused our biography on. So who was she? Well, one of the fascinating things that I found about her was that she was born a citizen of Spain, but in 1821, when Mexico was acknowledged their independence from Spain, she became a citizen of Mexico. And then in 1848, after the Mexican-American War, she became a United States citizen. So even though she never moved more than a couple hundred miles from her birthplace, She had 3 nationalities throughout her life. But what I found even more fascinating was none of those nationality changes were anything like the effect, didn't affect her life anywhere near as when Colorado established the 37th parallel as its southern border. I'm not sure with our things here if you can see it, but in this map, you can see the very edge of what was the New Mexico territory. And when Colorado established the 37th parallel as its southern border, it basically chopped off part of New Mexico. And it separated Maria Dolores, along with about 7,000 people of Hispanic descent that were living in southern Colorado, from the governments of New Mexico, from the language of New Mexico, and from the laws of New Mexico. And that was a huge impact on Maria's life. So who was she? Well, she was one of the first settlers in the San Luis Valley, arriving around 1850. So she was here, 8 to 10 years before the gold rush began. And she settled on the Sangre de Cristo land grant. So in the Anglo version of trying to settle the West, we had the Homestead Act, where people were given 160 acres. But in the Spanish way of doing things, they had land grants. And these were huge swaths of land that were given to an individual or a couple of individuals. And the person who received these land grants had to find settlers to settle 2/3 of the land grants. And if 2/3 of the land grant was settled, then that person was able to keep the final third of it for themselves. So the people who got these land grants were very motivated to find settlers. And people like Maria Dolores and her family were very motivated to go to these land grants because that allowed them to have their own land. So part of the agreement when you moved on to a land grant was you would receive your own agricultural land as part of a settler there. And then the community that you settled with would have communal land, and they would have communal land in the mountains where you could hunt and gather wood, and communal pasture land where your critters could go and graze. And so, as with most people who have Hispanic descent that settled in southern Colorado, Maria and her family survived as farmers and ranchers. So how did these people settle? Well, most of them settled in groups and homesteads around a communal walled plaza. So their homes made out the outside of the plaza, and then there were gates at either end. And in the evening, all the livestock could be driven inside and the gates would be closed and watched because, of course, you were moving into Native American territory and the Native Americans were trying to protect their territory. So there was a lot of hostility. The people in southern Colorado lived a traditional Catholic traditions, and so their life sort of rotated around it. They established the first non-native church and the first store in Colorado, long before people came to settle for the gold rush. So I don't speak Spanish, so I'm going to destroy this word, but they dug acuillas for communal water rights. And what they did is they community-wise dug these water canals, these acuillas, and then everyone had water on their individual land. So every person was granted their own water rights, even though it was a communal water right. And even though after the Mexican-American War and they were granted full citizenship, they were truly treated as second-class citizens, especially in Colorado. We were not very nice to our Hispanic population. And this is a picture of the relatives of Maria Dolores, her son and her grandkids. So, as a citizen of Colorado, Maria Dolores lost a lot. She suddenly was now living under English common law, which was very different from traditional Mexican law. And probably the biggest thing she lost was the right to own her own property. You got to remember, during the gold rush, women, based on common English law, had no rights. We couldn't even keep our own children. As soon as we married, everything we owned went to our husband. But in Mexican laws, no, that wasn't true. A Mexican woman could own land, they could inherit property, they could buy property. So because she now lived in Colorado, she lost that right. And she lost the right of a government representation in her native language. Of course, here in Colorado, everything was in English, and in New Mexico territory, everything was in Spanish. What was really interesting to me is, as I did this research, yes, the people of Southern Colorado were allowed to give representatives into the Colorado territorial governments and the Colorado state government, but a lot of times they were very slow to translate the documents into Spanish. And these representatives couldn't even choose their own translators. And in one document I read, they talked about how they got a translator who didn't speak Spanish. And so it was really terrible discrimination, and they were often considered foreigners. So I live in Westcliff, and Westcliff is part of territory that used to be Mexican territory. And I look around and I'm like, why isn't there any land ranches that were owned by Hispanic populations or mines? And what I've found, I think, is that because they were considered foreigners, they weren't allowed to make mining claims and they weren't allowed to own the land. So there was a lot of discrimination that way. So the big issue, though, that eventually happened is when Colorado became a state were these communal land grants. So they were very different, as I said, from our homestead laws. And the Anglo population didn't necessarily always confirm them. So what I found was that if an American, like in the Sangre de Cristo land grant, territorial Governor Gilpin had bought part of that land grant was confirmed. Others were not, which was really interesting. The other thing that was sort of sad that I found was that titles for their land, each of these people received titles for their individual lands. They were, of course, in Spanish. They would be sent into the Colorado government to try and confirm their land, and they'd mysteriously go missing. So that was very difficult. But the hardest thing was the communal land rights. They were not almost never transferred to individual towns. So for the longest lawsuit in Colorado history has been over these communal land grants and the Sangre de Cristo land grant. And it was interesting to see that some of Maria Dolores's families fought for the right to continue using these communal lands. And they won that in 2002, although I just read a more recent newspaper article that says even though they won their rights, the person who owns that land is still fighting their ability to be able to use that land. All right, so I'll turn it over to Jan to talk about Albina.
Thank you. Albina Washburn was born in Illinois in 1837. And despite the fact that she married at just 16 years of age, she must have received a good education because she was an excellent and efficient writer and speaker. She, along with her husband and 5-year-old daughter, arrived in Denver City in 1860. They came not seeking gold, but farmland, and very quickly established a dairy and fruit farm in what is now the southern part of the city of Loveland. Okay. Albina joined a number of farmers' organizations, the Grange, the Loveland Farmers Institute, the State Dairy Farmers Association, the Colorado Forestry Association, a Horticulture Association, etc. And she wrote and presented papers at those organizations, often choosing topics that would be of interest to the women, household economy, a woman's view of forestry, horticulture for women, etc. You can see the Washburn cabin on the Big Thompson River in this picture. Okay. Early in the Colorado Women's Campaign for Women's Suffrage, Albina joined in. She wrote often for a national publication called the Woman's Journal, which advocated for national women's suffrage and also highlighted the achievements of women. One of her articles in that, publication is credited with influencing the American Women's Suffrage Association to send organizers and speakers to Colorado to help with the campaign. That resulted in the formation of the Colorado Women's Suffrage Association, and Albina served as corresponding secretary and a spokeswoman for that group. She was on the committee that presented the case for women's suffrage to the Colorado Constitutional Convention in 1876. They were only successful during that campaign in getting the women's right to vote in school elections, not full suffrage. But the Constitutional Convention did provide for a referendum to be held the following year in 1877, so that the male voters of the state could decide whether women would get full suffrage. They turned it down. So Albina and a woman named Alida Avery decided to take a slightly different tactic and organized a Colorado branch of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. It may be surprising to you, but many women of the time did not believe they should vote, or they were on the line about it. And the WCTU provided an organization that those more conservative women were apt to join. And in that group, women like Albina and Alida were able to point out to the women that they needed the right to vote in order to protect their home and family, which is what those women believed they should be involved in. They still believed in the separation of spheres, where the woman's place was in the home, not out in business or politics. They pointed out that if women could vote, they could vote for prohibition of the sale of alcohol. And then a sober husband would bring home the paycheck instead of frittering it away on booze. And they could vote for legislation so that they would have the right to fight for custody of their children in a divorce situation, all that sort of thing. It wasn't until 1893 that women finally gained the right to full suffrage through a wide grassroots campaign that included the efforts of the WCTU, among other organizations, women knocking on doors, etc. So that was the end of that. And Alida went on to try to improve. I'm ready.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. Women, Albina was able to find other ways to also improve the lives of women by organizing cooperative exchanges. She wrote that she sought a way that, quote, women who are usually moneyless could obtain honestly the necessaries of life. She said, why not share with one another what each has to share? She first organized and managed a cooperative exchange in Denver, then in Loveland, and eventually one in Fort Collins. And women in those groups successfully traded everything from pork and beans to poetry books. In the Fort Collins cooperative exchange, she decided that she should invite men to join the group as well, and they could exchange their physical labor for the products of the women. Okay. The success of Albina's cooperative exchanges probably was just a short step before she decided to embrace socialism. She wrote for the Labor Enquirer, which was a Denver socialist newspaper, and eventually edited a woman's column for them. And she also wrote articles in national publications expounding on her methods to change from capitalism to socialism. She advocated for large boycotts that were, in her words, very much just a large expansion of her cooperative exchanges. Okay. In the 1900 U.S. Census, Albina aptly summarized her life when she listed her occupation as radical reformer. She spent about the last decade of her life living with her widowed daughter in Fort Collins, attending the Unity Church and singing in the choir. She died in 1921 at 84 years of age. Now, Julie will tell you a little about one of the Native American women we chose.
So thank you. So Amache, for those of us who were raised in Colorado, at least my memories, was this dark time in Colorado in US history. And it was a camp in southern Colorado where Japanese were interned. I never realized that Amache was this amazingly beautiful woman. And I think what a sad remembrance of her to have this camp named after her. So Amache was a Cheyenne woman, and I'm not even going to try and say her name, but it means walking woman. And she was born around 1846. She and her family spent a lot of time down near Bent's Fort in southern Colorado. And because of that, they had a lot of contact with the Anglos there. When she was about 14, she was seen dancing by a man named John Prowers, and he fell in love with her. And after a traditional Cheyenne courtship, they married. She was 15 and he was 23. And since he was working at Bent's Fort, she moved into Bent's Fort. So she was this remarkable woman who spoke 3 languages fluently, but she was illiterate. So there's no writing in her own words about her life. So everything you get from external sources, which was really interesting. But I think she's just a remarkable looking woman. So I've always read about how, like at Bent's Fort, a man who marries a Native American gets a lot of benefits that way. But I never really thought about what benefits the woman might get. And I thought in Harriet Segerman's Land of Many Hands, Women in the American West, she wrote, Indian women with white husbands often played influential roles within their societies. Called women in between, these wives often were the ones to introduce new products, techniques, and ideas into their tribes. And I think that really says a lot about Amache's life. She really stayed between the 2 cultures, being both Anglo, and she stayed very much in contact with her Cheyenne roots. And she helped her tribe as much as she could, although I think her husband also benefited significantly from having a Native American as a wife. So one of the reasons I found Amache's story so interesting was her father, Chief One Eye. So he was a good friend of William Bent. In fact, it's said that he lost one of his eyes protecting William Bent. And he was unfortunately killed in the Sand Creek Massacre. But before the massacre, he was asked by Chief Black Kettle to carry a written note to Fort Lyon and give it to the head of Fort Lyon, who was Major Wynkoop. Now you've got to remember, this is 1864. The relationship between Native Americans and Anglos was really bad. In fact, Governor Evans had issued a proclamation that said, shoot any Native American you see on sight. And Major Wynkoop had followed through with that proclamation. So when Amache's father went to Fort Lyons, he expected to be shot on sight. And he went with the hope that they would find this letter and it would be passed on to Major Wynkoop and there might be peace between his people and the Anglos. It was wonderful that he was not shot on sight, and instead he was taken in front of Major Wynkoop. And he managed to convince the Wynkoop to go and talk with Chief Black Kettle and to perhaps try and negotiate the release of some of the white captives that they had then. And that council led to the Camp Weld Council, where Governor Evans and Colonel Shivington met with Chief Black Kettle and other Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders who wanted peace. And at the end of the Camp Weld Council, Governor Evans and Colonel Shivington told these Native Americans who wanted peace to go down with Major Wynkoop and stay near Fort Lyon, because then they'd know that's where the peaceful Indians were. And they were to be at an area called Sand Creek. And of course, several months after the Fort Camp Weld Council, we had the Sand Creek Massacre, where Amache's father and many of her relatives were killed. I found it interesting, Amache's daughter at one point wrote about their life. And in that description, she described a meeting in Denver where Amache was at a meeting with a bunch of women, and she was introduced and asked if she knew Colonel Shivington. And it said that she stood up very proudly and replied in English that all could see here, "No, Colonel Shivington, I should. He was my father's murderer." I thought that was pretty powerful. One thing I didn't know is that after the Sand Creek Massacre, there was restitution. And on this map here, I've put it in here because I find it interesting. In 1851, we had the Fort Laramie Treaty, and that area in orange is where the Cheyenne and Arapaho Reservation was going to be. And then by 1861, after the gold rush began, that area had shrunk down to that little purple. And you can see where Sand Creek and Fort Lyon were in relationship to Denver. So not only was the Sand Creek Massacre just a terrible thing in terms of being told to go there and you'd be safe, but they were on their own reservation. But anyway, what I found was that Native Americans who had family members killed in the Sand Creek Massacre received restitution. Now, what I found is that a lot of these Native Americans were married to Anglos. So Amache and her daughters received several hundred acres of land, and they chose the land along the Arkansas. And that was one of the reasons the Prowers became such strong cattle people, is they had this land that she received as restitution. Eventually, the family moved to a town called Boggsville along the Santa Fe Trail, and Amache not only raised her family, but she helped run the family store, the stagecoach station, and the cattle business. And one of the things, if you've never been to Boggsville, I highly recommend it. There was another place that the curator opened it up and gave us a tour during COVID. But Boggsville was a cultural crossroads. And you had Native Americans with Amache, you had some Anglos, and you had Hispanic women. And they all coexisted and ran this town well. And what was fascinating about Boggsville was the women owned the land. Amache because of this restitution. And then the Hispanic woman who was there had part of a Hispanic land grant. So she owned that land. One of the other interesting things about Amache is she included Cheyenne traditions in both raising her children and even down to the orientation of her home, so she could go out and watch the sunrise in the morning just as she would from a teepee. In 1878, the railroad passed by Boggsville, so the family moved to Las Animas, and eventually her husband signed over their merchant store, and she ran it completely by herself. When she was 38, her husband died, and she ran their huge cattle business and the store and everything else that they did. You know, there's Prowers County in Colorado, and that is named after this family. She was really remarkable that way. And I thought Nell Propst's quote in her book, Uncommon Men in the Colorado Prairie, was apt. She wrote, "Amache was a beautiful, refined woman, and Boston society talked about her with fascination, but also with respect and genuine liking. I feel like Amache conquered the Anglo society, but she never forgot her Cheyenne roots."
And I'll talk a little bit about Mary Hall and the Baker expedition. She was born in New York in 1838 and grew up in Michigan and Indiana. At 17, she married Nathan Nye, a man 7 years her senior. In 1860, Mary, along with her husband, father, 4-year-old daughter, and 2-year-old son, came to the Pikes Peak region. All 4 adults filed mining claims in California Gulch near the present town of Leadville. Okay. An enterprising man named Charles Baker claimed to have found large mineral deposits in the San Juan Mountains near the present-day town of Silverton. He dubbed the spot Baker City, although no town existed there. As you can imagine, people were very anxious to go there and try their luck. In December of 1860, a party formed in Denver, a very large party of 200 to 300 hopeful prospectors headed to this Baker City. Mary and her husband and 2 young children were among that party. As you probably can imagine, travel was very difficult in the winter. with oxen pulling the wagons or mules pulling the wagons through deep snow. And people were very cold in snowstorms, and some were resorted to burning their wagons just to stay warm. And they had to cut down trees to provide forage for their livestock. Groups that could travel more quickly broke away from the main party, as did ones who felt that they knew a better route than the one the main party was on. Hopefully you can see in the map the starred route, and that is the one that likely Mary and her family followed. They arrived in Animas City in March of 1861. Okay. That's about 13 miles north of Durango, across from the Pinkerton Hot Springs. And no doubt that hot springs looked very inviting to those cold and weary travelers. But it also looked like the travel would be easier on that west side of the Animas River. So they built a log bridge across it. The picture on the right, compliments of your own Animas Museum, shows the sign that the DAR erected in 1930 to honor some of the people who were in that party. Toward the bottom in the center, you may be able to make out it says Nate Nye and family. On that far side of the river, they traveled north about 15 more miles until they were totally halted. Wagon travel could not go any farther due to the deep snow. That was at the base of Castle Rock Peak near Cascade Creek. They made a camp there, and someone with a wry sense of humor dubbed it Camp Pleasant. The women and children stayed in the camp while the men went out hunting and prospecting. Some men donned snowshoes and tromped north toward Baker City. Charles L. Hall is one of the men who made it that far. He then went out on a prospecting trip with 2 other men. They soon got lost in that wintry and rugged terrain, ran out of provisions, and nearly starved to death. It is said that they chewed on their leather breeches, ate a treasure trove of ants underneath a log, and even drank the broth that they made from boiling empty flour sacks. Eventually, they were rescued by men from that baker's camp, and it is said that Hall only weighed 48 pounds when he was rescued. Eventually, he was brought down to Camp Pleasant, where Mary's family said she nursed him back to health. Another version of the story says that it was a group of women that tended to him, but nevertheless, that's probably when Mary and Charles became acquainted. By then, the people in the camp were very discouraged. They'd not been able to glean any wealth by prospecting. Hunting was very difficult, and provisions were growing low for them. There were also rumors of small parties traveling through the area being harassed by Native Americans, and some even killed. And that was because these prospectors were on the Native American land, and the Native Americans wanted them to leave. So a large party formed with all of the women and children, and they returned to Denver in June of 1861. Okay. We couldn't find any records for Mary for the latter half of 1861, so her life at that time is somewhat of a mystery. But we do know that around that time, Nate Nye deserted Mary and took their children back east, left them with his family there, and returned west. Mary had no legal recourse to gain custody of her children. As Julie mentioned earlier, married women had no right to own property, and children were considered property at that time. Her family says she was granted a divorce by the mining camp she resided in at the time, and that's very plausible. The Colorado Territory recognized mining camp divorces. However, for some reason, Mary filed for and was granted a divorce later in Arapahoe County in March of 1863. Okay. Around 1862, Mary and Charles married, and Charles claimed land with the salt springs on it. It was a little northeast of Antero Junction and south of Fairplay. He built a salt works on that land, and it was the second manufacturing plant in Colorado. Later on, he took on a couple of partners who were mainly investors, and they built a larger plant that you can see in the picture on the right. For a while, the salt works was reasonably profitable. There was a large demand for salt, not just for table salt, but in Colorado, it was used in an ore processing step called chloridization. And Charles could sell the salt more cheaply than that was brought by costly freight wagon transport from the east. But then the railroad came to Colorado, and that reduced the price of the salt that was brought from the east. And by then, Charles had depleted the nearby source of timber that he used in fueling the plant. Okay. So gradually the Halls turned to ranching, and their cabins served as a wayside inn for travelers. Not that they were doing it for profit, but just because it was convenient for travelers coming through that isolated area. You can see the cabin behind the large home in the picture to the right. When travelers were caught in a storm, it was often said that they were sleeping head to toe on the floor in their cabin and on benches, any spot they could find. But they always knew when they came to the Hall cabin that they would receive a hearty meal and somewhere to sleep. Mary's was known for her excellent cooking, and Ovando Hollister, who was a writer and editor, visited there in 1866, and he praised Mary's cooking, writing, quote, "I must not refrain from saying a good word for Mrs. Hall's coffee, cream, butter, raspberry shortcake, wine, and jelly, all of it of the sweetest and finest flavor. Also ducks, canvasbacks, roasted and buttered. Think of that and weep." You'll notice Hollister pointed out her sweet cream and butter, and she ran a sizable dairy operation, no doubt selling her milk, cream, and butter to others as well, and enhancing the family's income. By the late 1860s, the family had grown to include 2 daughters and a son, and they had outgrown that small cabin. So they had a ranch house built. It was in the Second Empire style and an unusually elaborate home to be found at that time in a rural mountainous area. Okay. Around the middle 1880s, Mary lost her eyesight completely and badly injured her foot. Doctors in Colorado told her she would never regain her sight and that she would likely have to have her foot amputated. Not one to easily give up, she, along with her 2 daughters, traveled east seeking medical help. They stopped on the way to visit friends in Chicago and heard of a Christian Science practitioner there who was said to be very successful. Mary decided to be treated by him, and she regained her eyesight and ability to walk. She and her older daughter stayed in Chicago long enough to study under a Christian Science instructor there and earned their credentials to be Christian Science practitioners themselves. They returned to Colorado in Denver and began practicing Christian Science there. They were so successful in treating people there that others wanted to become Christian Science practitioners as well. Mary, on several occasions, sent to Chicago to have instructors come to teach more people here. And eventually, her older daughter became an instructor and her younger daughter a practitioner. The picture on the right is of Levita Place, a luxurious apartment complex where the Halls lived during some of the time that they were practicing Christian Science. Okay. Mary practiced Christian Science until her final illness that lasted about 4 months. She passed away in 1899 at 61 years of age and is buried in Fairmont Cemetery in Denver. She left a legacy of the continued practice of Christian Science in Denver, and along with her husband, the Salt Works Ranch that is still owned and operated by members of her family and is on the National Register of Historic Places and is designated a Colorado Centennial Farm. Now Julie will conclude our presentation.
So I hope we've given you a taste for some of the women in our book, and hopefully we've showed how some of these women were not just wives. They helped on the ranch. They helped run boarding houses and restaurants. They ran general stores. Their husbands may be the post office masters, but they were the ones that ran the post office. They helped bring philanthropy and religion to the state. Suffrage, they fought for. They invested, some of the women invested in businesses. What we didn't touch on as well is race relations. One of the women we covered in the book is a Ute woman. She's the half sister of Ouray. And I've always wondered, because she was really well known. She was part of the Meeker incident. In fact, after the Meeker incident and her fight to help bring the hostages that were held there out, the women and children, free them, she was dubbed God Bless Susan. And yet she and all Utes from the northern Colorado were forced from the state. And so part of the contributions, I wonder, is what would our state have been like if we had allowed Native American women to remain in the state, and if we had treated some of our minority women with more respect, minorities in general, not just the women. No matter which woman you look at, though, they all faced incredible hardships and challenges. Some of them came to Colorado and improved their lives. Some had regrets. In the journal that I found of Elizabeth Byers, she wrote, "Had I known the hardships and experiences which lay before me in this pioneer country, all the gold in the mountains could not have induced me to come." And of course, those who were here prior to the gold rush probably wish that it never happened at all. So we're going to conclude with a quote from Cokie Roberts in her book, Ladies of Liberty, The Women Who Shaped Our Nation. She writes, "History looks very different when seen through the eyes of women." And we hope that our book will allow you to see Colorado's history in just a different way and see how women played a role in that history. So thank you for paying attention and listening to us. And we would like to open the presentation up for questions.
All right, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Julie and Jan, for taking the time today to share your wonderful book with us and for saving and telling the stories of these amazing 10 women. I hope everybody's like all ready to read the rest of the book now and buy a copy. So with that, do we have any questions? You can either type them in the chat or raise your little hand and we can let you talk. I'm not seeing any. And anybody, I can try this. We haven't practiced this. So anybody in the classroom, we can let you talk. And talking is permitted in the classroom. So anybody has any questions there, go ahead. See if we can hear it.
I think you've got it still, at least I can see the microphone knocked out.
Yeah, okay. We didn't practice that, so we won't try that one. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll run downstairs. Let me do a check, quick check in the classroom. And we'll finish up if there are no questions. And if you do come up with any questions, email them to us and we'll get them to Jan and Julie. So we'll get them answered for you. Let me do some final shameless self-promotion. We do have several copies of Julie and Jan's book for sale here at the museum. They're the softcover ones. They are $22.95 plus tax. Sorry, we can't ship. We can only do local sales. But if you want one shipped, or you want a hardcover, or we run out, go to Maria's. Maria's Bookshop downtown has them, and I know they'll be very happy to help you out. These make great gifts for history lovers. So definitely check one out. And worst comes to worst, can I say the word? They're available on Amazon too. So we can get you a copy of the book.
So if you don't mind me saying, they are published by Filter Press Books. And if you go to Filter Press Books online, you can order also there. I'd much rather you do that than Amazon.
Okay. Then still not seeing any questions. We are open, of course, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday from 10 to 4, and Wednesday, Friday from 1 to 4. Since Christmas and New Year's both fall on Mondays this year, it doesn't affect our schedule. We'll be open as usual on the 23rd and the 26th. The 23rd and the 30th, and then the 26th through the 29th, weather permitting. So if you're looking for some place to bring your guests, come on by. If the streets are bad, we won't be open just because it's just not safe for our staff and volunteers. So check our Facebook page or our Instagram page, and we'll post whether we're open or not for sure on there. So we'll see how this winter goes, but come on by. Now, next month's webinar on January 13th at 1 p.m., our founding director, Robert McDaniel, will be joining us for a second webinar in his series, From This Earth, the Timeless Beauty of Pueblo Pottery. This time, Robert will be talking about a wonderful little pot from the Zia Pueblo that we have on exhibit, or it's not at the moment, but it will be in the entryway, as well as some of the other pots in the collections that came from the old Indian room at the Durango Public Library. So this talk on January will be live in person in the classroom and on Zoom. So check our website for the registration link in the next couple of weeks, and we'll send out the regular e-blasts with more information. Colorado Gives Day is past, but our annual campaign will go on through the end of the month. A generous donor has pledged $40,000 in matching funds. So know that when you donate, your donation will go even further. Now, remember, the museum gets very little support from the city of Durango and no support from La Plata County. So we depend on all of you and all of us to keep on going and providing these kind of presentations. Let's see. Anything in the classroom? I'll make one last check. No questions? So finally, to keep up with us, members only get access to our online catalog database, and you can sign up on our website. Visit our website, animismuseum.org, for more resources, including the recording of this talk that will be there by tomorrow. Subscribe to our e-blast, follow us on Facebook, like us on Instagram, and if you want to see continued programming like this, be sure to hit the donate button on our website. We appreciate all your support. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks again, Julie and Jan. We really appreciate it. This is great. Thanks so much. Have a great weekend, everybody, and happy holidays, and we'll see you next year. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Okay.